They had perfect gardens for 50 years, never used Roundup. Roundup didn't even exist. Here's exactly what they used. And I'm not talking about some remote homestead you can't relate to. I'm standing in a garden right now that's been chemical-free for 3 decades, and it's so clean you could eat off the dirt. Not a single weed. The beans are climbing their poles without competition, the lettuce is crisp and unbothered, and the squash vines are sprawling through bare, healthy soil. This is the Appalachian way, and the entire weed control budget for this garden was $2. Not per week, not per month. $2 for the whole growing season. I'm breathing in that rich, damp earth smell while a honeybee works the zucchini blossoms, and there's not a dandelion, not a crabgrass, not a single intruder. That's not luck. That's a system, one that my neighbor's 90-year-old dad Lester taught me when I moved here 15 years ago. He just shrugged and said his family had never spent a dime on weed killer, not once, not ever, and their gardens fed them through the Depression, through wars, through everything. So I asked him to show me, and what he revealed changed the way I see every single patch of soil I've ever planted. By the time we're done, you'll know exactly how to kill every weed you're currently fighting, and, more importantly, how to stop new ones from ever showing up. No protective gloves, no scary warning labels, no $30 jugs of blue poison. But first, you need to understand something that most people never connect. Because long before Monsanto was even a company, families in the hills of West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and western North Carolina kept kitchen gardens alive through brutal summers and relentless weed pressure. They didn't have glyphosate. They couldn't run to the hardware store. What they had was a system built on observation and sheer practicality. These were folks who watched the moon phases for planting, who could read the weather in the curl of a leaf, and who knew that a healthy garden was a collaboration with nature, not a war against it. They passed down techniques in the same way they passed down quilt patterns. Through showing, through doing, through late summer evenings spent pulling a stray weed while the lightning bugs came out. And the beauty of it is, all of it still works. You don't need a chemistry degree or a trust fund. You need about $2 worth of something you might already have in your kitchen, a scrap of cardboard, and a shift in perspective. So let's talk about why you might even bother with this old-fashioned approach when the garden center sells you certainty in a plastic jug. The history of modern weed killers is full of strange winding roads. Glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, was introduced by Monsanto in 1974. But before that, the very same molecule was patented as a pipe-cleaning chelating agent, something that bonds to mineral scale and strips it from metal pipes. A chemist named John Franz, working at Monsanto, discovered almost by accident that it kills plants by blocking the shikimic acid pathway, an enzyme system that plants and algae use, but animals don't. That discovery turned into a multi-billion-dollar product. For decades, the marketing told us it was safer than table salt, biodegradable, practically benign, and it did wipe out weeds like a flamethrower. But then the cracks started showing. In 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, a branch of the World Health Organization, classified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans, igniting a firestorm of lawsuits. Gardeners began to look twice at that familiar blue jug. And the numbers that followed tell a story of trust broken and billions spent. The U.S. herbicide market hit $8.2 billion in 2024 alone. People are pouring money into chemicals, many of which are used on common weeds that can be destroyed with nothing more than your kitchen kettle and a little morning sunshine. So the question isn't whether these commercial killers work. They often do for a time. But at what hidden cost? And what are you really trading away when you spray around your tomato plants? That's where the Appalachian alternative comes roaring back. Not as nostalgia, but as applied biology. Let's start with the weeds you can see right now, the ones mocking you from the sidewalk crack and the raised bed. Because there's a piece of grade school science that kills weeds faster than any synthetic spray. And it all begins with a word you might almost remember, osmosis. Osmosis is the movement of water across a semi-permeable membrane from an area of low solute concentration to one of high solute concentration. It's why pickles get crunchy in brine and why celery goes limp in a dry fridge. When you douse a weed leaf with a concentrated vinegar salt solution, you flip that process on its head violently and rapidly. Instead of the plant's cells drawing water in, the high salinity on the leaf surface pulls water out. The cells literally dehydrate, their cytoplasm shrinks away from the cell walls, and the plant tissue collapses and dies. On a hot sunny day, you can see the wilting begin within hours. That's why this homemade brew can rival, or even beat, many store-bought contact herbicides, and it costs pennies. The recipe, which I've confirmed with Extension Service fact sheets from the University of Maryland, is laughably simple. 1 gallon of cleaning vinegar, the kind with 6% acidity, though even the standard 5% kitchen vinegar works if you're persistent and the sun is fierce. 1 cup of plain table salt. No need for fancy sea salt. The cheapest stuff is perfect. And 1 tablespoon of liquid dish soap. The soap is the secret sauce. It acts as a surfactant, a substance that breaks the surface tension and the waxy cuticle on the weed's leaf, so the vinegar and salt can sneak through the plant's natural armor instead of beating up and rolling off. Without it, you're just washing the leaves. With it, you're delivering a lethal dose. Mix this all in a spray bottle, shake it like a cocktail, and take it outside on a sunny morning. Spray every green leaf until it's dripping. The next day, those leaves will be brown and crispy like autumn. Dandelions, chickweed, plantain, even the tough broadleafs that muscle through concrete, they all succumb. The taproots might need a second treatment a week later, but at roughly 40 cents a gallon, you can afford to be generous. No cancer warnings, no protective gear beyond maybe not spraying into your own eyes. It's just pickling chemistry aimed at your enemies. And while that vinegar brew works beautifully on above-ground growth, there's an even more ancient, even cheaper method for spots where you want annihilation, not selectivity: boiling water. I'm not being folksy or metaphorical. I mean actual water, brought to a rolling boil, carried carefully to the weed. 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a temperature at which proteins denature instantly. When that scalding water hits the crown of a plant, the point where stem meets root just at soil level, the cells burst, the proteins coagulate, and the root tissue essentially cooks in place. Researchers at multiple extension services have documented that a single pour of boiling water on a mature dandelion or thistle delivers near total kill rates. It costs maybe a nickel's worth of natural gas or electricity to boil a gallon. That's free, practically. But here's the catch. Boiling water will kill absolutely anything it touches, including your beloved heirloom petunias and the feet of your blueberry bushes. So you use it like a sniper rifle, not a shotgun. It's perfect for the weeds that sprout in the cracks of a gravel path, between paving stones, along a fence line where nothing else grows. I've seen Lester, the old man who taught me this entire system, stand over a clump of thistles with a kettle and just pour, his face a study in calm satisfaction. No goggles, no respirator, just hot water and a steady hand. And when the weed wilts a day later, the next heavy rain washes away the salt from the dead plant and the cycle is complete. Now, what if you're facing a bed that's completely overrun, a space so dense with weeds that you can't even see the soil, let alone plant a seedling? That's when you bring out a technique that Appalachian families have used for a century and which permaculture enthusiasts now call lasagna gardening, but which my grandmother just called putting the garden to bed. You're going to smother the weeds with the ultimate byproduct of our modern life: cardboard. Gather up plain corrugated cardboard boxes, or thick layers of newspaper, but nothing glossy or colored, just plain newsprint and plain brown cardboard. Soak it all thoroughly in a tub of water or with a hose until it's heavy and pliable so it won't blow away in the next breeze. Then, lay those sheets right over the weeds, overlapping the edges by a good 6 inches. On top of that, you pile 3 to 4 inches of organic mulch: wood chips, straw, shredded leaves, spoiled hay, whatever you can source for free or cheap. Now, what happens underneath is a botanical burial. No light reaches the weed leaves. Without light, no photosynthesis can occur. The plants, even stubborn perennials like bindweed or quackgrass, will first turn pale and yellow, then completely die within about 2 weeks. Meanwhile, in that dark, moist environment, earthworms and soil microbes go to work. They consume the cardboard and the dead plant material, converting it all into rich, dark castings. Worm poop, essentially, that amends your soil without you lifting a finger. I've done this on a patch of ground that my neighbor swore was cursed with nutsedge, and after leaving the smother in place for 6 weeks, I peeled back the remnants to find soft, fluffy soil that smelled like a forest floor and not a single living weed root. This method also works like a charm for converting a weedy patch of lawn into a new vegetable bed without ever firing up a rototiller. And that's key, because one of the worst things you can do in a garden is till too much. Tilling brings dormant weed seeds to the surface, giving them exactly the light and oxygen they need to germinate. The cardboard smother keeps them buried and dead. But I know what you're thinking. You don't want to wait 2 weeks. You want that massive dock plant or that deep-rooted burdock gone today. And you don't want to throw your back out doing it. That's where the homemade Appalachian weed puller earns its keep. Before you drop $40 on a fancy Fiskars stand-up weeder, let me show you how to make one for about 15 cents, using stuff lying around your garage. Find an old broom handle. Any sturdy length of wood about chest height will do. Take a 3-inch deck screw, the kind with a coarse thread and a flat head. Hammer it halfway into the end of the handle, leaving the head sticking out. Then grab a metal file and sharpen the opposite edges of that screw head until it forms a crude 2-pronged fork, a tiny pitchfork. You've just built a dandelion digger that will outlast your garden. To use it, you step beside the weed, slide the fork into the soil at a 45-degree angle right next to the root, twist to break the soil's grip, and then pull. The entire taproot, that deep, resilient core that regrows if broken, comes up in one satisfying piece. I know a 92-year-old woman named Miss Cora who lives a holler over and still uses a version of this tool that her great-grandmother made from a horseshoe nail and a hickory limb. She cleared 100 square feet of thistles in under 10 minutes one afternoon while I stood there with my expensive store-bought weeder that snapped on the second root. That moment taught me something about tradition versus marketing. The puller isn't the only homemade tool, though. There's also the hula hoe, or stirrup hoe, which Appalachian gardeners have built from old saw blades and shovel handles for generations. It's a stirrup-shaped blade, sharpened on both edges, that you push and pull just under the soil surface. It severs weed seedlings from their roots without bringing up deeper soil, so you're not exposing new weed seeds. My Uncle Jess used to say, "Weed when they're just a white thread, son. A thread and 2 leaves the size of a penny nail." He'd go out on a dry morning after the dew had burned off and glide the stirrup hoe through the rows, and within an hour, 1,000 little weedlings would be lying on the surface, already wilting in the sun. The secret here is timing and dryness. Dry soil crumbles and lets go of roots, wet soil clumps, and gives the weed a chance to reroot. That's another Appalachian maxim. Weed on a hot, dry afternoon, the sun itself becomes your partner. Now, before we move from killing to preventing, we need to understand something invisible but critical: the weed seed bank. Every square foot of garden soil contains thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, of weed seeds. Some species, like lamb's quarters and velvet leaf, can lie dormant for 40 years, just waiting for a flash of light to trigger germination. When you rototill, you essentially shout, "Wake up!" to that entire sleeping army. Appalachian farmers figured this out a long time ago and practiced no-till or shallow-till gardening before the term was even invented. They'd only disturb the top inch, and they'd do it with a hoe, not a machine. Then they'd cover the soil with a protective layer, a concept that ties directly to the 4 prevention methods I'm about to share. Because killing weeds is really just a temporary fix. If you stop there, you'll be back in the same wrestling match next month. The true Appalachian system transforms your garden into a place where weeds simply can't get a foothold in the first place. And the star of that show is an ingredient you probably walked right past in the organic gardening aisle thinking it was just for feeding chickens: cornmeal. But not just any cornmeal, a specific byproduct called corn gluten meal. It's a yellow, crumbly powder that looks like fine polenta, and it's a pre-emergent herbicide, a term that's going to change your gardening life. A pre-emergent doesn't kill existing plants. It stops seeds from becoming plants. Here's the biology. Corn gluten meal contains dipeptides, small protein fragments, that inhibit root formation in germinating seeds. When a weed seed wakes up and sends out its first tiny root, called a radicle, into soil that's been treated with corn gluten meal, the dipeptides prevent that root from developing. The seedling sprouts, uses up its stored energy, and then withers, starved and rootless. It's like a thin, invisible shield at the soil surface. And the brilliant part is that this only affects seeds. Already established plants, your tomatoes, your peppers, your zinnias, have roots deep enough and developed enough that the corn gluten meal doesn't touch them. It's completely selective, completely natural, and approved by the USDA organic program because it's just a corn milling byproduct. For a 200 square foot garden, you need about 2 cups of this stuff, which costs somewhere between $1 and $3 depending on where you buy it. At my local feed store, a 20-pound bag costs $20, and I use less than $1 worth each spring. That's where the $2 seasonal budget comes from. But timing is everything, and the old Appalachian clock for this is not a digital screen, it's a forsythia bush. When those yellow flowers explode on the roadside and in the yard, the soil temperature at about 2 inches deep hits roughly 55 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the exact moment when crabgrass, foxtail, pigweed, and dozens of other summer annual weeds are about to break dormancy. So you wait for that blooming signal, you spread your corn gluten meal evenly across the garden like you're feeding chickens, and then you water it in lightly. After that, you do not, under any circumstances, disturb the soil for at least 6 weeks. Every raking or cultivating would break the protective layer and bring new seeds up into the germination zone. Once the corn gluten meal is in place, you layer on the second prevention method, strategic mulching. This isn't just scattering a token inch of straw for looks. You apply a blanket of organic material 3 to 4 inches thick, no less. I learned this the hard, sweaty way. I once put down 2 inches of pine straw and congratulated myself, only to watch dandelions push up through it like they were shrugging off a light blanket. 4 inches stops them cold, smothering them while also preserving soil moisture and moderating temperature. But you must leave a 2-inch gap around the stems of your vegetable plants so they don't rot. This mulch also feeds your soil as it breaks down, slowly adding organic matter. In the old days, Appalachian families used whatever they had. Shredded leaves they'd raked in the fall and stored in burlap sacks, grass clippings from the yard, straw from a small grain patch, even pine needles from the woods. My great-aunt Lenore used to say, "The soil's got to wear a coat, same as you." And just like a coat, It keeps things that don't belong from getting too comfortable. Now, what about the off-season? Your garden doesn't go dormant just because you stop harvesting. That bare winter soil is a welcome mat for weeds like chickweed, henbit, and bittercress. Winter annuals that wait for cold to germinate and then explode in early spring before you even get your seeds out. The third prevention method is a winter cover crop, and it's one of the most beautiful self-sustaining cycles in gardening. After you pull your last tomato plant or dig your last potato in the autumn, you broadcast a heavy dose of annual ryegrass or cereal rye seed over the entire bed. You rake it in lightly with a rake or a leaf, and then simply let it grow. The rye germinates fast, often within days, forming a dense green carpet that chokes out any winter weed trying to establish. All through the cold months, its roots hold the soil in place, preventing erosion, and they actually capture nutrients that might otherwise leach away with rain, holding them in plant tissue. Come spring, when you're ready to plant again, you cut the rye down with a scythe, a sickle, or a mower. Let it lie on the surface for a week to begin decomposing, and then you plant your crops directly through the straw-like residue. That residue continues to act as a mulch, suppressing weeds, while the rye's roots decompose and feed the soil. My grandfather called this green manure and swore it was better than any bagged fertilizer. He planted his winter rye on the day he dug his last potatoes, like a clockwork ritual. And when March came and the soil was workable, he'd walk out with a grub hoe, slice the rye flat, turn it under with a fork, and say, "That's the only weed control I'll need till June." No chemicals, no backache, just biology and the turn of seasons. The fourth prevention method is so simple, you'll be mad you didn't think of it. Stone borders. If you've ever visited an old farmstead in the mountains, you've seen those flat sandstone or creek rocks edging the kitchen garden, often mossy and half buried. They aren't just decorative. They're a physical barrier against underground invasion. Many of the worst perennial weeds spread by rhizomes, underground stems that travel horizontally, popping up new shoots, feet away from the mother plant. Quackgrass, bindweed, wild violet, Johnson grass, all of them will send runners right under your carrots and burst up where you least expect them. A stone border, buried a few inches deep with its top edge an inch or two above the soil, acts like a subterranean fence. The creeping rhizome hits that stone and can't cross. It turns aside, or it surfaces on the path side, where you can spot it and remove it before it enters the bed. It's a slow, permanent moat. You haul the stones once, from a creek, a field pile, or a construction site, and they work for decades. Free, durable, and utterly effective. I've seen Lester point to a section of his garden that has been weed-free for 20 years, and he'll just tap the rock with his boot and say, "That rock, and I have an understanding." And now, I promised you a concrete weekend plan to go from weedy mess to pristine, weed-free garden for the price of a cheap coffee. So here it is, from Friday evening to Sunday afternoon, all tied into one smooth sequence that you can adapt to any garden size. Friday evening, after you get home from work, fill your largest stock pot with water and bring it to a rolling boil. While that's heating, mix your vinegar, salt, and soap brew in a pump sprayer or spray bottle. Once the water's boiling, carefully carry it to the worst offenders, the monster dock by the shed, the thistle in the fence line, the dandelions that have taken over the gravel driveway. Pour directly on the crown of each, watching the soil steam. While you've got the kettle going, spray the vinegar mix on every broadleaf weed in your beds, making sure the leaves are glistening wet. Then let it all sit overnight. Saturday morning, those sprayed weeds will already be brown and limp. Now grab your pre-soaked cardboard or newspaper and cover any remaining weedy patches or entire beds you've cleared of crops, overlapping all seams thoroughly. Shovel on your mulch, 4 inches deep, no skimping, and tamp it down firmly. By noon, the visible weed problem should be smothered and neutralized. Saturday afternoon, take your homemade weed puller and walk the garden, digging out any deep-rooted survivors. The dandelions that regrew a little, the thistle with the stubborn taproot, any dock you missed. With the tool, it goes fast. Then, store the puller right in the bed for next time. Sunday morning, over the entire growing area, spread your corn gluten meal, 1 cup per 100 square feet, like you're sprinkling Parmesan on a pizza. Water it in gently with a garden hose set to a soft shower. You don't want to wash it away. Do not till, do not rake. Then apply your thick mulch layer around your plants, remembering that 2-inch stem gap. Finally, drag your stones or bricks into place to edge the beds, burying a couple of inches if you can. By Sunday afternoon, you're done. You've spent maybe $2 on the corn gluten meal. Everything else was already around the house or free for the taking. Your garden is now armed against weeds for an entire season without a drop of chemical poison. And here's a bonus fact that always makes me smile. Corn gluten meal contains about 10% nitrogen by weight. So when you apply it for weed control, you're simultaneously feeding your soil a slow-release organic fertilizer. You're getting a weed suppressant and a nitrogen boost in one application. That's the kind of elegant efficiency that makes you stare at that $40 bottle of glyphosate gathering dust in your shed and feel a little bit foolish, a little bit cheated. Because the truth is, the Appalachian system doesn't rely on brute chemical force. It works by understanding weed ecology. Weeds are just plants that show up because conditions invite them. By timing your actions to the bloom of a yellow bush, by blocking light and underground runners, by using a kitchen staple that stops germination at the molecular level, you're simply stacking the deck so that weeds never get a winning hand. My great-aunt Lenore once told me about her father's bean patch. He grew 20 long rows of half-runners on a steep hillside that would have exhausted a modern farmer. He never sprayed a thing. Every spring, he'd clear the patch by burning the old corn stalks from the year before. The ash raised the pH just enough to suppress some weed seeds, and the carbon fragments formed a light physical barrier. Between that and the dense canopy of bean leaves that shaded the soil by July, the patch stayed nearly weed-free until harvest. When someone asked why he didn't use chemicals, he just laughed and said he'd rather spend his money on more seeds than on poison. And that, right there, is the heart of it. This isn't really about killing weeds. It's about building a soil ecosystem that does the work for you. Earthworms, mycorrhizal fungi, beneficial bacteria, they all thrive under mulch and in undisturbed soil. And together, they create conditions where your beans and tomatoes outcompete the invaders. It's a slower, quieter process than spraying, but over a couple of seasons, you'll find yourself pulling fewer and fewer weeds, maybe just a handful a week. That's the Appalachian difference, a long-term relationship with the land, not a one-time chemical assault. And you can start that relationship today, this weekend, for roughly $2. Next spring, when your neighbor's out there in full hazmat getup, respirator, rubber boots, long sleeves, and 80-degree heat, spraying glyphosate around his tomato cages, you'll be on your porch with a glass of iced tea, looking at a weed-free garden that didn't require a single warning label. Not because you're a better gardener, but because you tapped into a lineage of knowledge from people who couldn't afford to waste money and wouldn't dream of poisoning their own food. So this weekend, take a walk around your garden. Notice the weeds, but also notice the gaps, the bare soil, the edges, the low spots. Grab your vinegar, your salt, your scrap cardboard, your broom handle, and a small bag of corn gluten meal. Spend $2 and a little afternoon sweat. And by next summer, when a friend leans over the fence and asks how your garden got so impossibly clean, just give them a knowing smile and say, "Same way my great-grandma kept hers." They'll never look at their pantry the same way again,